Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fluent English Daily. In today's lesson, we are going to explore advanced linking words for IELTS Band 7 and Band 8. Linking words help us connect ideas, show logical relationships, and make our answers easier to follow. However, using advanced linking words does not mean filling every sentence with formal expressions such as moreover, furthermore, or consequently. To achieve a higher IELTS score, you need to choose linking words that match your meaning and suit the situation. The language you use in IELTS speaking should normally sound natural and conversational, while your IELTS writing should be more formal and carefully controlled. By the end of this lesson, you will know how to add ideas, show contrast, explain causes and results, give examples, clarify your meaning, and emphasize your strongest points. Let's get started. Why are linking words important in IELTS? First, they help the examiner follow your answer. Without clear connections, your ideas may sound like separate statements rather than one organized response. Linking words allow you to show whether you are adding information, presenting a contrast, explaining a cause, describing a result, or giving an example. For instance, compare these two sentences. Public transport is affordable. It is sometimes unreliable. The ideas are clear, but their relationship is not fully expressed. We can improve the connection by saying, public transport is affordable. However, it is sometimes unreliable. The word however immediately tells the listener that the second idea contrasts with the first. At Band 7 and Band 8, the goal is not to use more linking words than everyone else. The goal is to control them accurately and use smooth transitions that sound natural. Do not force formal connectors into every answer, especially in IELTS speaking. IELTS rewards clear organization, not complicated vocabulary used without a clear purpose. A useful way to learn linking words is to organize them by function. Do not simply memorize one long list. Instead, think about the relationship you want to express. To add another idea, you can use also, in addition, or not only that. To show contrast, use however, whereas, or on the other hand. To acknowledge one point before presenting another, use concession phrases such as although, even though, or having said that. For causes, we commonly use because, since, as, or due to. For results, we can use therefore, as a result, or consequently. To introduce examples, use for instance, or a good example is. To clarify an idea, use in other words, or what I mean is. Before choosing a connector, ask yourself one question. What relationship do I want to show? Once the relationship is clear, choosing the correct expression becomes much easier. Let's begin with expressions for adding information. In IELTS speaking, simple and natural choices are often the best. You can say, also, not only that, another thing is, or on top of that. For example, I enjoy living in the city because there are more job opportunities. On top of that, public transport is usually more convenient. These expressions sound conversational and flexible. In IELTS writing, more formal choices include in addition, furthermore, moreover, and as well as this. However, furthermore and moreover should not be placed in every paragraph. Overusing them can make your writing sound mechanical. Consider this weak example. Technology helps students. Technology also helps teachers. A better version is, technology helps students. In addition, it allows teachers to prepare lessons more efficiently. The improved sentence employs a proper linking word. It overcomes repetition and develops the second idea more clearly. Remember that a linking word should not simply repeat information. It should help you add a meaningful new point. Contrast and concession are related, but they do not have exactly the same function. We use contrast when two ideas are different. Useful contrast expressions include however, whereas, while, on the other hand, and by contrast. For example, city life is exciting, whereas rural life is generally more peaceful. The word whereas directly compares two different situations. Concession means that we accept one point, but then introduce another point that may be stronger or more important. Useful concession expressions include although, even though, despite this, having said that, and that said. For example, online learning is convenient. Having said that, some students find it difficult to remain motivated. Here is another comparison. The weak version is, online learning is convenient. It can be lonely. The improved version is, online learning is convenient. However, it can sometimes feel lonely for students. In IELTS speaking, phrases such as that said and having said that often sound more natural than highly formal alternatives. Cause and result expressions help us explain why something happens and what happens because of it. To introduce a cause, use because, since, as, due to, or owing to. For example, many people move to large cities because there are more employment opportunities. Notice that because, since, and as are normally followed by a clause. However, due to and owing to are followed by a noun or noun phrase. For example, flights were delayed due to bad weather. To describe a result, use therefore, as a result, consequently. This means that, or this can lead to. A weak answer might be, people use cars because buses are bad. A more developed version is, many residents rely on cars because public transport is unreliable. As a result, congestion tends to become worse during rush hour. This version provides a clear cause and a logical result. For band 7 and above, try to go beyond one basic connection. Explain the consequence, and when possible, support it with an example. Examples make your ideas clearer and more convincing. The most common expressions are, for example, and for instance. You can also say, a good example would be, one clear example is, or this can be seen in. For example, technology has changed the way people communicate. For instance, video calls allow families to remain connected even when they live in different countries. The example is effective because it is specific and directly supports the main idea. Avoid vague examples, such as, there are many examples of this. This expression doesn't actually explain anything. Instead, name a situation, group, place, or experience. In IELTS speaking, your examples do not need to include official statistics. You can use personal experiences or realistic situations. In IELTS writing, examples should be relevant and logically connected to the argument. Band 7 examples are not necessarily complicated. They are clear, specific, and useful. Clarifying expressions are particularly useful in IELTS speaking. Sometimes your first sentence may not express your idea perfectly. Instead of stopping completely, you can explain it in another way. Useful speaking phrases include, what I mean is, in other words, to put it simply, to be more precise, and what I'm trying to say is. For example, living in a large city can be exhausting. What I mean is, people often have to deal with traffic, noise, and a faster pace of life. These expressions help you develop your meaning while maintaining fluency. In formal writing, you may use that is to say. In other words, this suggests that. This means that. Or, more specifically, consider this simple statement. Work-life balance is important. We can clarify it by saying, work-life balance is important. In other words, people need enough time to rest, spend time with their families, and recover from work. The second sentence explains exactly what the speaker means. Emphasis helps guide the listener or reader toward your strongest idea. Useful emphasis expressions include especially, in particular, above all, most importantly, and the key point is that, for example, public transport benefits many groups, especially people who cannot afford a private vehicle. Here, especially highlights one particular group. You might also say, several factors influence academic success. Most importantly, students need consistent motivation and effective study habits. Use emphasis when presenting your strongest reason, highlighting a specific example, or finishing an answer with a clear message. However, do not overuse these expressions. If every point is described as the most important, none of them will sound important. Similarly, repeating especially before every noun will weaken its effect. Emphasis should guide the listener to the main idea, not decorate every sentence. The linking words you choose should match the style of the task. In IELTS speaking, natural and flexible expressions are usually more appropriate. Useful choices include also, actually, that said, what I mean is, another thing is, and a good example would be. For example, I enjoy working from home because it saves time. That said, I sometimes miss speaking to my colleagues face-to-face. This sounds like natural spoken English. In IELTS writing, use clear and controlled expressions, such as in addition, however, therefore. For instance, this suggests that, and as a result. For example, remote working can reduce commuting time. However, it may also lead to social isolation. Do not make IELTS speaking sound like an academic essay. Using moreover, furthermore, and consequently in every spoken answer may sound memorized and unnatural. Choose language that is appropriate for the communication situation. Let's examine some common mistakes. The first mistake is overusing formal connectors. Words such as furthermore and moreover can be appropriate in writing, but they often sound stiff in everyday speaking. In IELTS speaking, also or another thing is may sound more natural. The second problem is incorrect grammar or punctuation. We normally write, however, the policy may be expensive. But with although, we need a clause. Although the policy may be expensive, it could produce long-term benefits. After despite, use a noun or an ing form. Despite the high cost, or despite being expensive. Another mistake is using a connector without the correct logical relationship. Do not use therefore unless the second idea is a result of the first. Do not say on the other hand unless you are presenting a genuine contrast or alternative perspective. Finally, avoid memorized chains such as first of all, secondly, moreover, furthermore, consequently. Using several connectors does not automatically make an answer coherent. Band 7 and Band 8 linking is accurate, varied, and meaningful. Let's finish with some practice. The first pair of ideas is, I like online learning. It is convenient. We can connect them by saying, I like online learning because it is convenient. Or, I like online learning. In particular, I appreciate the flexibility it provides. The second pair is cars are useful. They cause pollution. A possible answer is cars are useful. However, they contribute to air pollution. The third pair is many people work from home. Companies save money. We can say many people now work from home. As a result, companies may save money on office space for more. The final pair is technology is useful. Students can learn anywhere. A stronger version is technology is extremely useful because it allows students to learn from almost anywhere. Let's review the main functions. To add ideas, use also or in addition. To show contrast, use however or whereas. For concession, use although or that said. For results, use as a result or therefore. To give examples, use for instance or a good example is. To clarify, use in other words or what I mean is. The final rule is simple. Choose the connector that matches your meaning, not the one that sounds the most difficult. Thank you for watching Fluent English Daily. Keep practicing and try using 3 of today's expressions in your own IELTS answers.